big talking point, not just because the rate is going up to 15%, but also because the threshold at which businesses start paying it is being lowered to £5,000, which dramatically increases the cost of employing low-wage workers. And that, combined with rises in the national minimum wage, well, it's left many businesses scratching their heads wondering how on earth they're going to find that extra cash. And the reality is, some of those businesses, while they may absorb the extra cost, some of them will have to lower wages as a result, in cases where they can, of course, excluding in those cases where their workers are already on the national minimum wage. It's something that OBR pointed out, the Office for Budget Responsibility, yesterday, saying that this would actually lead to a drop in real incomes. And the Resolution Foundation today warned that this would also weigh on the economy, leading to further stagnation in living standards. In fact, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, we heard from Paul Johnson just there, actually warned that the amount the Treasury is actually hoping to get from this tax increase, 25 billion, was far overly optimistic. And that's because it's going to lead to a drop in salaries, as I pointed out, which would lower the amount that the Treasury is actually going to gain from this tax increase. So it's more likely to be in the region of somewhere in the region of £16 billion. So overall, as I said, a big budget. But people will be thinking, well, OK, well, taxes are going up, but what will be the consequences for public services? Are we going to get a dramatic increase, or improvement rather, in public services? And here, the Chancellor has taken a massive gamble. There's a big public infrastructure programme happening in the background, but it could take more than one electoral cycle for the growth benefits of that to really come through. Paul Johnson from the IFS called it a courageous move, but it's also a risky move. And in the meantime, day-to-day spending on public services, as we know, the Chancellor's fiscal rules stipulate that has to be met by tax revenues. Well, they're in line for a big increase this year and next, but after that, the spending envelope is actually looking pretty thin. And actually, the Chancellor has baked in cuts to some unprotected budgets, things like prisons, courts, local authority funding. And how plausible are those spending cuts? Well, you heard from the IFS there, Paul Johnson saying that it was pretty implausible, which means that unless we get a big upgrade to economic growth, the Chancellor could be back in a year's time asking for more in taxes.
Gurpreet in Grimsby there for us this morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Whilst the government was at pains to insist that working people would not see a direct rise in tax reflected in their payslips, it is, of course, a very different picture for employers. So what effect will those higher wages for low-paid workers, as well as that national insurance contribution hike, have on businesses? Well, delighted to say it, I'm joined by Siobhan Haviland, who's the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, who joins us live. First of all, what's your overall impression of the budget? Are you relatively optimistic about these changes?
Look, it was a tough budget for business. There are new costs for business on national insurance, and clearly you referenced minimum wage. And like the Chancellor, that means business are going to have to make some tough choices about where they find those extra costs. Our research shows they'll look at things like increasing prices, taking it in the margin, slowing down investment. And of course, none of those are good things for economic growth. On the flip side, of course, we heard from the Chancellor that she wants to invest for the future. She wants to invest in infrastructure, schools, hospitals, energy, and a trade strategy. And all of that is good for future local economic growth, because infrastructure build means supply chains, and that's good for SMEs. So two sides of that budget.
In saying that, let's talk about the impact on businesses. Do you feel that this may mean businesses laying off workers, not necessarily employing at the same rate they had expected to do so, or maybe even some businesses simply say we cannot function with this now level of tax burden?
It's particularly hard for sectors of the economy that have large salary bills, that have large, employee bases. For bigger businesses, they'll be able to absorb some of it into their balance sheet. For SMEs, it's going to be very hard, although the Chancellor did bring a number of small businesses entirely out of paying national insurance. Businesses, the last thing they want to do is cut salaries or stop recruitment. So they'll try and find as many other ways as possible around pricing or margin or slowing down investment intentions before they, reduce wages. But in the end, there's only so much money in the bank, so you have to find it somewhere.
So how do you see this panning out? I mean, in the end, if you look at the growth forecasts, they seem to taper off. Is this, and Labour have talked about growth a lot. They've talked about how the private sector needs to provide growth. Do you think this is a budget that is going to help enable that growth? Or could it, as some critics have claimed, actually dampen it down?
So what we need to see now is the chance to deliver on the things that she talked about. So an industrial strategy that sets the direction for business, an infrastructure plan that delivers at pace. So we want to see big infrastructure build come online as quickly as possible, and a trade strategy. Remember, we are one market. There are 200 markets out there. We need British businesses exporting all over the world. That will drive economic growth that the OBR have not taken into account. And an infrastructure plan to get Britain back building will drive local supply chains, and that will be really good for local economic growth.
And just very finally, Siobhan, on this, I think there's a recognition, there's a dispute over the figures, that the public finances aren't necessarily in a great state, that, taxation is there in part to help plug that. Do you think it was fair, or it is fair, that businesses are taking the brunt of this rather than workers? Do you think, actually, when it came down to it, that was the fairest thing to do?
I think that the new government clearly indicated where they were going to have to go with this. I think everybody recognises that the Chancellor had to make some really hard decisions. We all want economic stability. We have been asking government for a long time for a long-term strategy, clarity, and that is what she is promising us. So let's see the delivery now. Let's see that implementation happen. And we want to work in partnership with government, right? Business, government, we all want the same thing. Let's work together on industrial strategy and make that happen.
OK, as you say, the delivery and how it pans out will be fascinating. Siobhan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Siobhan Haviland, the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, joining us there. Well, with changes to rates of capital gains tax, a rise in stamp duty for second homeowners and investors, as well as the pressures on small businesses, the Chancellor has actually hampered her chances of achieving economic growth by scaring off potential entrepreneurs and financial talent. That is the accusation. Well, let's speak to Barney Hussey-Yeo. He's the founder of Clio, and someone I think would agree with that accusation. Is that right?
I would disagree, actually. I'm slightly more ambitious than most people. I think it was a budget that was anti-austerity. The spending and the investment is bigger than I thought it would be. The problem is the growth forecasts are really poor. It is still stagnation, there's still low growth, and this is going to hit normal people the most. And the biggest problem in my eyes is there's no plan, there's no strategy of how we're going to build high growth companies in this country. If you compare us to the US, they have hundreds of massive tech giants in their economy that makes them grow, which drives job creation, which drives taxes. In the UK, the FTSE 100 combined is not as big as NVIDIA. There's no strategy, there's no plan to build these companies. So while we're, in the tech community, we're very positive that it is anti-austerity, there's more investment, we need a plan and we need a strategy to keep entrepreneurs in the UK to build these massive tech giants and really get the economy growing again.
In saying that, what did you make, though, of changes, for example, to capital gains tax? I mean, we have heard from entrepreneurs over the last couple of weeks saying that that was driving people already to leave the country. Do you think that's been overblown then, that Britain is still a place for entrepreneurs despite some of these tax changes?
They briefed that it was going to be bigger, so there's a little bit of relief, I think, in the tech community that it is where it is today. But I think the most fundamental point here is people were already leaving. The best entrepreneurs were going to the US already to raise late-stage capital, to list their companies on the NASDAQ. The UK is not as competitive as the United States in building and scaling these high-growth companies. And we have to change that. We need a strategy. We need a plan. We need to get back to growth. And if we can't do this one simple thing, our economy will stagnate again for decades to come.
It is extraordinary. We're all expecting GDP figures out of the United States this afternoon. They're looking at 3% growth. Apparently, we haven't seen 3% growth for a hell of a long time in this country. You say we need a strategy. What does that strategy look like? What does Rachel Reeves need to do over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years to get genuine economic growth? Because as you've rightly pointed out, the IFS, the Budget Office for Budget Responsibility, seem to be suggesting that that growth is going to remain pretty tepid until the end of this decade.
Yeah, it is embarrassing, the growth rate, and you compare it to the US over the decade. But what do we need to do? We need to reform public markets. We need the LSE to be risk on. We need pension funds to be investing in tech companies. We need to change how you list companies in this country. 2, we need high growth capital at the late stage for these companies. There is no late stage capital for growing businesses. For example, Clio is a 150 million ARR profitable, fast growing business. If I want to raise growth capital, I'm 100% going to the US. There's no big growth capital funds here in the UK because pension funds aren't investing. We're not risk on as a nation. And then 3, our regulators, they are not pro-innovation. They hamper, they hold us back. If you compare the UK to the US's system of the checks and balances of state and federal, it is a very different regulatory environment, which allows companies to thrive, to grow, and to really be innovative. The UK doesn't have that. They have a huge amount of powers in the UK, and that just curtails all growth, and we need to change that.
OK, but let's probably, I suppose, be a little bit optimistic. As you say, it wasn't as bad as you had feared, and maybe other entrepreneurs like you. Is there an element of optimism here about the UK, all the things that we can do that actually might enable all those things that you've just talked about?
We've got an incredible talent base. You look at our universities, the research and development that comes out of our country. This is a fantastic place to grow and scale an AI business. It's just when we get to that late stage, what is happening? If you look at DeepMind or Arm, all these companies are moving to the US to list, or they're being acquired by bigger US companies. We need fundamental change in how we scale companies in the United Kingdom. We're good at the early stage. Venture capital in the early stage works in the UK. We have the talent, we have the know-how. It's just there's not that late stage investment. There's not that late stage reform in public markets. The regulatory environment curtails growth. So we need some fundamental changes if we want to compete, if we want to make this a country that can get back to growth, so that can build high growth companies and change our economy. And if we can't do this, it is more decades of stagnation.
And just to be a little bit political about this, when you look at Rachel Reeves, and this budget, many people say it's a very Labour budget. It's tax and spend and borrow, if you like. But she talks a game about private investment, about trying to find economic growth. Do you think this Labour government is a pro-business government that effectively you and others can work with?
So the message from Number 10 is like they hear us. They're thinking about the entrepreneurs. I think it comes down to are they going to make any changes? This was an incredibly Labour budget, as you said. It's really high tax, it's really high spend. There was not a big focus on entrepreneurship. They are saying they're going to review things, but politicians say a lot of things. So can we trust them? Is I think the big call from the tech community at the moment. There's been good news stories that behind the scenes they're saying they're working on it, and let's just see. Let's see in the next couple of months, can they deliver on their promises? And if they don't, it's just more stagnation, and that affects working people, and we're going to be in this cycle for decades to come.
OK, really fascinating stuff. Barney, thank you very much indeed for your time. Barney Hussey-Yeo there, the founder of Clio, entrepreneur, with his reaction to the budget. And just on that, we are hoping, and we will be hearing from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor very shortly here on Sky News. They're doing a Q&A session at the National an NHS hospital. We'll have that and much more coming up on Business Live, including Russia finding Google a hell of a lot of money. In fact, the entire world's GDP. We're explaining all that in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
Big stories don't always come from big cities. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent.
You are not getting in this elevator, okay?
The judge made it very clear that she could see
our Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Sir Keir Starmer MP, and the Chancellor Exchequer, the Right Honourable Rachel Reeves MP. So Welcome.
So we're just going to go over to the West Midlands. As you can see, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister speaking, taking questions on the NHS after yesterday's budget. Let's have a listen in to Rachel Reeves.
As Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the first budget ever delivered by a woman Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that was a huge privilege to be able to do that. In that budget, I've tried to fix the foundations and wipe the slate clean after a lot of the economic instability and chaos we've seen the last few years. I tried to do that in a way that, as much as possible, protected the living standards of ordinary working people. But I did have to make difficult decisions on tax yesterday, but they were necessary to bring the stability back to our economy and to ensure that we had the money for the National Health Service. And I was able to announce £22.6 billion of additional money for day-to-day spending in the health service to bring the waiting lists down. We made a commitment in our manifesto for 40,000 extra appointments every single week in the NHS, and I'm confident that the money that we set aside yesterday will enable us to deliver that, working together to deliver that. And in addition to that, £3.1 billion for capital investment in the NHS, hospital beds, hospital improvement, the diagnostic equipment and scanners that you need to be able to do your jobs. So I hope that that will make a difference to you as staff in the National Health Service, and a huge thanks from Keira and me and all of us for what you do, but also make a massive difference to the patients you treat. So that was the theme of the budget yesterday, but I'll now hand over to the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer.
Great. Well, look, can I start by saying a massive thank you to all of you for the work you do. We really appreciate it. Everybody that you care for really appreciates it. Every day you make a difference to the lives of people in and around these communities. So thank you for that. And I do know it's been a really hard few years, but we are really grateful for what you've done. Thank you for showing us some of the things you do at this brilliant hospital this morning, because we've seen what you're doing in relation to strokes. Brilliant work. That was really inspirational and reinforces in me what we can do with more innovation, etc. And, of course, with heart valves as well, we saw some brilliant stuff this morning. Look, we are a government that's only 4 months in at the moment, but I hope you can begin to see the change that we're bringing about. Most of all, and really important, we're going to be a mission-driven government, and that means a driving sense of purpose. What are you going to change? How are you going to change it? We've got 5 missions. The first one is really important, which is growing the economy, which means making people feel better off, which is why the choices that we made yesterday in the budget are so important, making sure that we're protecting working people so that in your pay slips and the pay slips of millions of people across the country, you're not going to see an increase in what you have to pay, because we're not going to be able to lift living standards unless we make that basic protection. But one of the other missions, and there's only 5, is the NHS, and the mission there is to pick the NHS up, to get those 40,000 appointments and treatments done every week, to get the waiting lists down, but to do more than that, actually to make sure the NHS is fit for the future. We look back very proudly at the Labour government after the war, which created the NHS in the first place. I think given where things have got to, we now need the 2024 Labour government to pick the NHS up, reimagine it and make sure that it's absolutely fit for the future. And you'll be doing that with us, because we want to hear from you about this. We've got a 10-year plan for the NHS, the change we're going to bring about, and we need your ideas. I'm a big believer in listening to people who are doing the job to get the best ideas about how we can do the job better, and that's been reinforced by the discussions that we've had here in this hospital this morning. Obviously, it was really important yesterday for us to put more money into the NHS to make sure day to day we can relieve some of the pressure, allow you to get on with the job that you need to get on with. You don't need us to tell you how important that is. Also put in more money on capital for the longer term, the changes, the technology that you're going to need. All of that has to be done with reform and change at the same time. And what do we mean by that? We mean making much better use of technical work, AI, digital, etc. Huge opportunities there for us to move quicker and do more Secondly, to move to a preventative model where we're catching things earlier on. Now, you will all know the worth of this. You know, just this morning we're talking about people with heart problems, don't know they got heart problems, could have been picked up much earlier, wouldn't have been in A&E, probably wouldn't have been in hospital for 3 weeks, would have been in here or a hospital like this being treated much more quickly. So preventative is really important. And then the other big change will be to make sure people can access healthcare closer to where they are in their communities, so that, again, that can really help on the preventative side. Pharmacists doing a lot more. So there's a lot of change. We need you to help us with that change because that reform needs to happen. But the ambition here is to make sure that we can say, we've got an NHS back on its feet, which everybody desperately needs and everybody desperately wants, but also an NHS which is truly fit for the future and where you can really look at pride at not just the everyday work that you could do, but the fact that your fingerprints are going to be on the model for the NHS for the future, which is a great thing to do. I mean, if you look back at those that were the first people working in the NHS who shaped it for so many years, this is our opportunity to do the same. And what we're trying to do is we inherited a pretty bad situation with the budget. There's not much money left in the economy. Some of the money that should have been accounted for wasn't accounted for, so we've had to make difficult decisions. £22 billion worth of money which wasn't on the books back in March when the last government did the sums. We've had to deal with all of that. That's obviously a challenge, but let's use it as an opportunity to say, well, in which case, let's be mission-driven. Let's make sure that we get the NHS where it needs to be. I look forward to working with you on that journey. So thank you very much. We're going to now take some questions from you. I think any of you can ask any question. It does, on the NHS, it's absolutely fine. It doesn't have to be on the NHS. You can ask us anything you like. Well, within reason. The cameras are rolling, but you know what I mean. So where should we go? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Burbridge. I'm a consultant in acute medicine.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Amy Burbridge. I'm a consultant in acute medicine. I've been working in the NHS for 19 years. Thank you for the increased funding. It's incredibly welcome at a very difficult time. Now, my main concern is physician wellbeing and burnout, particularly amongst our resident doctors. Now, you've announced these huge amount of income that's coming to the NHS. How can we be assured that that income will translate to staffing gaps that we've got, the increasing number of rota gaps, that over the winter we're not going to be really stretched. We're not going to be working in A&E with short-staffed. We're not going to be working in acute medicine, having to cover lots of different areas, which is incredibly challenging. Patient safety is at risk.
Yeah.
How can we have some assurance that, you know, the money will go towards that?
Well, thank you for raising that, because that will be on everybody's mind, wherever they're working in the NHS. There's been a huge strain on for a number of years. Obviously, COVID was very, very impactful. And then the very fact of having waiting lists that are very high is not a good environment for people to work in. And also being undervalued, quite frankly. When the last government wasn't able to bring down the waiting list, who did it blame? It blamed you. Yeah. And that is disrespectful. That undervalues what you're doing. So the first thing, it's not a complete answer, is a mindset change. Actually, some basic respect. My wife, as you may know, works in the NHS in one of the big London hospitals, so the morale of the staff is a sort of daily conversation. But it is really important because guess what? If you value your workforce and treat them properly, then it actually works better across the piece. But we do need to back that up with a workforce plan to make sure we've got the right sort of cavalry coming through to fill the places that are needed, and really go much, much faster on the technology that you need to take some of the weight off you. Now, look, I'm not going to pretend that by next week it'll all be fixed, because too many politicians have done that. It's going to take time, but what we did in the budget yesterday is the first step, the down payment, if you like, down that road to make sure that you can do your jobs better and we can have the NHS that we need. Rachel, was there anything you wanted to add to that? Let's go, yeah. I need some members behind me as well.
Matthew Pryor, Deputy Director of Pharmacy. So pharmacy teams and their fantastic work is historically underutilised across the NHS, especially as our expertise, skills and scope in legislation grows. So within secondary care, how does the government plan to utilise pharmacists, pharmacy technicians and pharmacy assistants to improve patient outcomes, experience and ultimately reduce some of the work burden on other healthcare professionals as well?
This is such a good question because we can make much better use of our pharmacists. It's an example of the preventative bit and the neighbourhood bit, the neighbourhood health service, if you like. There are plenty of examples, and I'll turn to Rachel in just a minute. But this morning, we were looking at some of the work done in this hospital in relation to valves in the heart and their replacement. Incredible work we've just seen with your team here. And one of the points they made to us was that with a stethoscope and AI working together, you could probably pick up the people who needed some of this treatment much, much earlier. And we were talking about whether that could be done. I assumed GP.